From the Department of History, Andrew Gordon.
Anybody know why this song is my theme? Yeah, 1967. There was actually another, there was a LP album produced after the 67 season called The Impossible Dream that had, I couldn't find it. I'd have a few LPs left. Maybe my folks took it. But anyway, it had the Carl Yastrzemski song, which if I could have found, I would have sent over, which is to the tune of the Rice-A-Roni jingle. Carl Yastrzemski, Rice-A-Roni, is the same number of syllables. Any case, the odd thing about my presence on this panel is that I may well be the least qualified, having heard the previous three talks, in terms of the depth and breadth and seriousness of engaging and thinking about baseball, at least until about 4 years ago, and then it was really only for about 9 months. And yet I may be the only one who's actually written a book on the topic. Michael, why on earth, do you have tenure? Why on earth would you ask the dean permission? That's the whole point. So I got this opportunity to. Well, I don't know. Maybe the law school runs differently, so they have more of a top-down situation. There's a brief clip from a DVD that I want to show that explains why I'm here, or it starts the story.
Matsuzaka-san, we welcome you to Boston. We can't wait to see you at Fenway Park. The best ballpark in America, the best fans in America. Let me just say, when you come to our city, you'll really enjoy it. You're going to enjoy your career in Boston, but you'll enjoy the people just as well.
Daisuke, Kurt Schilling here. It's cold in Boston right now, but I'm hoping that when you show up here in February to be a part of this staff, we can heat things up a little bit. I got 1 year left in my big league career. I plan on going out a World Series champ. I would love to walk out of this rotation a World Series champion and hand it over to a young Japanese stud and to Josh Beckett to keep the tradition going.
松坂さん、こんにちは。私はゴードンと申しまして、ハーバード大学で日本の歴史を教えております。毎年春、学生と教員一緒にレッドソックスの試合を見に行くわけですから。
So that's a clip that the Janet office very kindly and generously put together out of about a 7-minute production that was sort of, its legality was dicey in a couple of, no pun intended, respects. One, that we're not supposed to film for commercial purposes on campus without permission, but I didn't ask the dean for that either, and I filmed in front of the John Harvard statue. Right. And the other is that this was a recruitment, it was a love letter to Daisuke, about a 7-minute recruitment DVD to get him excited. This was produced in November of 2007 after the Red Sox had won the rights to negotiate for his contract and before he had signed. And so they were negotiating, and Scott Boras was standing in between, and the Red Sox figured, had a way to get this into his hands, I'm guessing through the Seibu Lions team or something, and they were looking for people to appear in it, and a friend of mine who was the president of the Japan Society of Boston knew I was a baseball fan, and he was working with the Red Sox. They said, do you want, how about having somebody from Harvard to join Kurt Schilling? Can you imagine? I mean, Mayor Menino, Kurt Schilling, and me. There was also a very distinguished company I was in. There was also a sushi chef from Brookline. There was a ramen chef from Porter Exchange. There was Hideki Okajima. There was a whole, it was a 7-minute production, and he did see it. He later said he was interviewed once and asked about it. He said, well, it was kind of hokey, but it was nice. I don't think that was really the reason he signed the contract, but he did sign the contract. We were sworn to absolute secrecy about the existence of this DVD because it would make Scott Boras very mad, because it's tampering, really, to go around his back. But then we were later told it was okay to talk about it. And I told a friend of mine in Japan who was a sports writer and then a book editor that, you know, when the wraps are off, I'm going to tell you the secret story of how I brought Daisuke to Boston. And for a while, I was proud of this. For about 2 years. And now I'm sort of defensive or embarrassed. People blame me. And he said, Gordon-san, why don't you write a book for us about Daisuke's first year on the Red Sox, combine the fans' perspective, because he knew that I was a big Red Sox fan, with the academic perspective, and we'll get you a press pass so you can do it. And I thought about this for about a minute, and I said, that's an offer that I can't refuse. And so the next thing, I was writing a book. Then I had to figure out what is the academic perspective. I knew what my fan perspective was. And I decided that I'd have to do some research and learning on a job. So in a way, it's equivalent to an undergraduate senior honors thesis, the English version, which hasn't been published. It's 112 pages long. Where's Jill? I was going to tell Jill, of course, she would probably not even given it a cum laude in terms of the depth of the evidence that's there. But it combined.
Did you write it the last night?
Oh, it was a race against time, that's for sure. And it was being translated. The April chapter was translated in May, and so forth and so on. It was like having a kid again. I should tell, Jill would know more about that. But I mean, it took 9.5 months from January, got the idea, to October it came out. It was so fairly lightweight. But what I did try to do in the book, and I want to talk about one, it was in each chapter talk about what was going on in the field and then connect it to some serious or semi-serious issue. One chapter was about the legacy of race and racism in Japan, going through from white immigrants coming into the game through African Americans to from the Caribbean to Japanese and other Asians. One chapter was about business, and there was somewhat arbitrary. The one chapter that was less arbitrary in terms of how it connected to a month was in May. That's when Daisuke ran into some trouble after a promising start. And then 2 or 3 good games at the beginning, and then 2 or 3 horrendous games. And so that was his first bad patch, and not the last. But there was a lot of speculation. What's going on with this guy? Why aren't things going right? And it was framed in terms of cultural differences. And that's really the issue that I want to talk about a bit. So there was a lot of speculation. What's wrong with Daisuke? And people tended to focus not so much on individual differences the way they would have if this had been somebody coming from another team. Oh, he's having trouble adjusting to the Boston market. Or from the National League, it's a different style of play. Well, that's a little bit like a different culture. That point, this was sort of writ large, the difference between Japanese baseball and American baseball. And there was all kinds of speculation, material speculations. The seams of the ball are different. The mound is a little different height, a little different firmness. They rub the ball in sand in Japan to get it coarse and for grip, and here they rub it in mud to get it ready for the gripping. There were questions of strategic differences. Daisuke likes to set up people for his fastball with his breaking pitches. Americans are supposed to set people up for the off-speed pitches with the fastball, and so he's all messed up there. So there's all this speculation swirling around, and then all of a sudden he did get his act together, and there was a brief stretch of in early May where he pitched 2 terrific games, almost 2 complete. It would have been the first 2 complete games in a row by a Red Sox pitcher in about a decade since Roger Clemens. But Franco pulled him out of the second in the 8th inning because they were winning about 10-1. And Daisuke was quite annoyed, I think, that he couldn't finish the game because he had had a point of pride of going deep into games. So how do we explain the turnaround in his performance? And it wasn't a permanent turnaround, and it related to an issue that's actually been an ongoing one up to the present, as far as I can tell. It had to do with returning to a more familiar routine of preparation for the ball games. And in the midweek bullpen session before the start, when he did really well against Toronto, Matsuzaka threw 109 pitches. That's about double the typical between starts bullpen session for an American player. And he did a lot more vigorous running. And this reflects a typical Japanese prep routine for playing, at least now in the late 2000s, around 2007 to the present. So to what extent and how do we understand this as a matter of a Japanese versus an American way of playing baseball? Matsuzaka analyzed his decision through this comparison. Japanese reporters asked him if the key change he made to help him out was more intense running, and he said, "Of course, while I've been incorporating American practices, after all, I'm Japanese. I think there are practices that fit a Japanese body, and I guess I decided to increase what I've been doing so far and try to do things again the way I did it in Japan." I was in the press box trying to learn the protocols of being a reporter, which it was a new experience for me. And most of the reporters thought it was kind of amusing that there was this Harvard professor hanging around pretending to be a sports writer. But in any case, and not everyone did. But so Farrell said he made a very conscious effort. This was after Daisuke had shifted his routine. He made a very conscious effort to make changes or to adjust into the American way from a pitcher's perspective, from a work perspective. Then he went back to his traditional training techniques with more running, more cross-training, and reduced the amount of upper body weight lifting. And Farrell was willing to sort of negotiate this with Matsuzaka. Terry Francona, and on other occasions, Farrell said the same thing. They thought the cultural explanations were nonsense. Francona says, I don't think it's cultural, it's just how good pitchers are, at one point. Farrell, at one point, took a different line than the previous one. He said to me, baseball is such a melting pot, regardless of a wonderful idiom, regardless of where you are from, body mechanics are body mechanics, deliveries are deliveries, competitors are competitors. But I do think there is something actually to the difference in how the games are played in Japan. But the point that I came to see, and I want to give one example of it and then close, is that these differences are dynamic, they're moving, and so that is, I think you can use the Matsuzaka episode and other episodes like this to get an understanding of culture interactions, not as sort of fixed things that bounce off each other or fixed things that impact each other like billiard balls, but in a more interactive and dynamic way. So the differences, that is, in the way Japanese play baseball and the way Americans play baseball are fluid and shifting. One example of this that's not related to Daisuke, and I'm much indebted to my colleague at Yale, of all places, a wonderful historian, a wonderful anthropologist, William Kelly, who's been studying Japanese baseball for well over a decade and written a couple of books, a book that is in many articles. Cheering. If you've ever seen Japanese pro baseball, you'll notice that there's really organized cheering groups that seem, from a point of view of American baseball, very, very weird. Where did that come from? It came from Japanese college baseballs who traveled to the United States in the early 20th century, and they watched American college football cheerleading squads of the early 20th century with their organized rooting and saw, this is cool. And they brought it back to Waseda and Keio, and from there it filtered up to the professional leagues when they were founded. So it's essentially an American practice of the early 20th century that now people think is a typical Japanese cultural trait. So that's one example. But coming back to the intense practice regime, this was at the heart of the adjustment issue that Matsuzaka and his coaches were engaged in. And there are Japanese words for this, nagekomi, which is hard throwing, and hashirikomi, which is hard running, which is not typically done in the United States now. But like the cheerleading, these practices have points of origin in an earlier point in American baseball history. And that's the point that I learned from some oral histories done with Japanese veteran ball players. A man named Iwamoto Takashi, a famous player with the Yomiuri Giants, who was interviewed by this American oral historian fairly recently, and he writes in the book, we didn't practice that much in the old days. You see, many of the players, he started in 1953, many of the players used to be in the military, so they already had lots of basic stamina. And as Iwamoto tells the story, at training camp in the 50s, there were none of the fierce practices of the hard running, the hard throwing, the 1,000 fungo drills that were later said to be essential features of Japanese baseball culture. Quote, the older players would slowly jog around the field just taking their time. Then they would start batting. They would hit about 10 ground balls for us to catch, and then we were finished. We didn't run that much. But then, 5 of our stars went to spring training in the United States, and we were all shocked. When they came home, Mr. Kawakami, that's Kawakami Tetsuharu, the greatest ball player in Japan at the time in the 50s, started running. I said, what has happened? This is the American way, he answered. And that's how it all began. Iwamoto continues, from then on in the winter we started to run. Now Japanese baseball teams have the reputation of training much harder than the United States. So this is the lesson I take away, that the thing that Daisuke thinks it's a Japanese body that demands a certain kind of practice regimen or between game regimen. I think that's nonsense. Others see it in a sort of cultural essence that connects to something profoundly Japanese in its culture. I see cultures as negotiations that happen across time and space. They transform each other. They exist. I'm not denying the difference today in how the right way to prepare for a game is typically understood in Japan or in the United States. But they're dynamic and fluid. And so when we were thinking about the title for the book here, Nihonjin ga Shiranai Matsuzaka Meija Kakume, an incredibly clumsy title that I'm now also embarrassed about to translate it, it says it's the Matsuzaka's Major League Revolution unknown to the Japanese. Well, unknown to the Japanese because it didn't happen. Unknown to anybody. But the idea that was behind this book in this title in May or June of that summer when the marketing geniuses, I wanted to have it be Harvardology of Daisuke or something like that, Matsuzaka no Harvard Gaku, but they didn't go for that. I think it would have sold better. Was that in this sort of cultural interaction, Matsuzaka was going to bring to America this Japanese way and prove its superiority, and then the whole obsession with pitch counts would shift, and there would be a kind of, he would bring a revolution back into the United States. And there were actually serious sports analysts in the United States in April, May, June of that season who were writing to that effect. You can look it up. Verducci, I believe, had a very thoughtful and long, in retrospect, wrong-headed analysis predicting this. So if revolutions are the story, this is more 1848 than, I guess, 1787 or 1776. So that's where I'll end. Thanks.